He's a fellow of the University of Cape Town, and he was the Dean Chair in the English department. He's a member of the Academy of Science of South Africa, and he's the author of an award-winning study, Raymond Williams, Literature, Marxism, and Cultural Materialism. And most recently, he's published Academic Freedom in a Democratic South Africa. His most recent publications include An Excluding Consensus, Grants and Loan Schemes, and the Need for Equitable Access to Higher Education. Last year, he delivered 2 brilliant courses at summer school. And I think some of the participants who is present today probably attended that course. So Marx and Freud, he delivered last year, and I think we're going to be looking forward to many, many interesting courses by John Higgins. So let me, without further ado, hand over to John.
Thank you, Zuleika, and for your kind words especially, and welcome to the participants in the course. I'm afraid this is new territory to me as well. I'm not quite sure whether I can speak sitting down, because usually I speak standing up and able to move around and so on, but we'll see what we can do. You know, the course, of course, is called An Introduction to James Joyce's Ulysses, and I thought it would be interesting to have as a summer school course, because I know that the people who come to summer school courses have, you know, kind of a large curiosity and a wide range of interests. And I suspected that, you know, many of them would certainly have heard of Ulysses and may even have a copy on your bookshelves already, or may have peered into it at some time. But I'm also very aware that many people who peer into the book for a first time or even a second time quite quickly turn away and find it just unreadable. Now, I started reading Ulysses a very long time ago. I think in part because of a particular circumstance, which was that, oddly enough, a film was made of Ulysses and released in the 1960s. But it was only shown, as far as I'm aware, in one place, and that was my hometown, Bradford in Yorkshire. And as a 15-year-old, I wasn't allowed to go and see this scandalous film, which was so scandalous it had been banned everywhere else apart from Bradford. But luckily, one of my school friends had a weekend job as a projectionist at one of the local cinemas, the cinema where the film was being shown. So I was able to sneak in and watch the film way back in the mid-60s, and began then to read Joyce quite avidly. So I could say that I began to read Ulysses 40, 50 years ago. And then I could say I've never actually finished reading it in the sense of stopping reading it. Of course, I've read it word for word many times now, but it's a book that each time you read, it brings you something new. And I teach the course, this introductory course, as a way of hoping that you who come to the course will be able to go away and read the book or read into the book with as much pleasure as I've been able to over the decades since I first read it. I'm going to be using a PowerPoint presentation, as I would in an in-person lecture. I haven't worked on Microsoft Teams before, so let's hope we can make it work okay. I'm now going to bring up the PowerPoint presentation, which will be my guide and your guide to the lecture that follows. Before doing that, though, let me just say that the lecture will last 45 minutes, and then there'll be time for 10 or 15 minutes of questions afterwards. I do prefer to have the questions afterwards because if they were to come up during my talk, that can, sort of break the flow of my thinking. And I think that's going to be more difficult to maintain without the actual physical presence of people. It's a very different experience, I think, for you as well as for me, going through this particular medium, which on the one hand, it's fantastic we can do this, but I think there are real costs in not having living bodies in the room with you, so you can see their expressions, so you can see if they're getting what you're saying, and to have that kind of visual dialogue that you can have while speaking in the flesh. Okay, so I'm going to try and call up the PowerPoint presentation to formally begin the lecture now, and I hope we'll be able to have a nice talk about it towards the end. Okay, so let's begin with a letter that the psychologist Carl Gustav Jung wrote to Joyce after he'd been asked to review Ulysses for a journal. Jung writes, "Dear Sir, your Ulysses has presented the world such an upsetting psychological problem that repeatedly I have been called in as a supposed authority on psychological matters. Ulysses proved to be an exceedingly hard nut, and it has forced my mind not only to most unusual efforts, but also to rather extravagant peregrinations. Your book as a whole has given me no end of trouble, and I was brooding over it for about 3 years until I succeeded to put myself into it. But I must tell you that I'm profoundly grateful to yourself as well as to your gigantic opus, because I learned a great deal from it. I shall probably never be quite sure whether I did enjoy it, because it meant too much grinding of nerves and of grey matter. I also don't know whether you will enjoy what I have written about Ulysses, because I couldn't help telling the world of how much I was bored, how I grumbled, how I cursed, and how I admired. The 40 pages of non-stop run at the end is a string of veritable psychological peaches. I suppose the devil's grandmother knows so much about the real psychology of women, but I didn't." So there you have, I think, quite a common response to Ulysses, that it's a hard nut to crack, that reading it involves you in some unusual efforts and indeed some extravagant peregrinations, traveling to many other books, dictionaries and works to get the most out of it. But my feeling is it doesn't have to be such a hard nut to crack, and that with a little bit of guidance, you can read the book or begin reading the book in ways which immediately will give you some pleasure. In this first lecture, then, I want to talk about the lectures to come and talk about the ways in which we can get some bearings on Joyce's Ulysses so that we can find our way through it. And The first thing I want to draw to your attention is the idea of Ulysses as a key modernist text, perhaps the greatest modernist text, but then to suggest that, you know, understanding one term only leads to trying to understand another term, so that when we say the way to understand Ulysses is to think of it as a modernist text, well, our next step is then to begin to try and understand what is a modernist text. And here, again, the preliminary move is to recognize that one of the striking features of modernist texts is that they always represent an inextricable intertwining of the aesthetic with the political. And let me then try and explain a little bit about the aesthetic and the political of modernism. And first of all, the political of modernism. And this is just to draw to your attention something which you're well aware of in one sense, but may have kept outside the scope of your thinking about modernism as an aesthetic, that the modernist period is one in which there are really dynamic tensions between horror and hope. This is a period in which the world around was visibly changing, was cracking up, was disintegrating, but also seeming to promise extraordinary new things. There was a spectrum of horror and hope in the modernist period, which we can, you know, sort of substantiate in very simple ways. The period of modernism sees the two revolutions in Russia, the first unsuccessful in 1905, the second successful from 1917. Those revolutions presented both horror and hope. Horror in the violence that ensued within them, hope in what they promised to people at the time, and which was understood as a utopian society, a new communist/socialist society that would be free of the burdens of the past. That was the hope involved in the revolution, one that, of course, was not fulfilled as such. The period was also the period of the First World War, as you know, from 1914 to 1918, which saw 9 million combatants die and 7 million civilians, an absolute bloodbath which had a massive effect on the psychology of both the immediate survivors of the war and their families, torn and damaged in multiple ways. At the same time, in this period, the idea of a new world order, the world order of imperialism, was coming into focus with its own hope and its own horror. And two of the first analyses of this came from the left, from Rosa Luxemburg's Accumulation of Capital and Lenin's Imperialism, the highest form of capitalism. In and through this period, then, we see ordinary people confronted with massive social and political changes, massive loss of life, lots of horror, but also lots of hope. It's from that cauldron that you have, matching that, an extraordinarily vital reinvention of artistic methods and procedures across all the arts, from music, from Stravinsky's Writer's Spring, for instance, to art in the work of Picasso and many others, in the new cinema, in the work of Eisenstein and Vertov and many, many others, in poetry, in the novel, in everything. matching the cataclysm of this period of political modernism, you have an absolutely astoundingly vital and various series of explosion in the arts. And then, just as a beginning, I want to mention one very simple, apparently simple fact of in 1920, in a conference in Paris, a new item arrived on the scene, the idea of having passports and having to have a passport in order to be able to travel. And this was something new. Prior to this agreement, people could travel from one country to another without a passport. This, in other words, brought to the fore ideas of citizenship and nationalism in new, quite practical and administrative ways. And I just want to say that, lest you think this background is too far away from Ulysses, that Ulysses is really, really interested in all of these things. Above all, in the idea of war, in the idea of nationalism, in the idea of revolution. These things form an essential background or framework to being able to get a grip on what's going on in Ulysses, as we'll see and as I'll try and show in the lectures to follow. Remember, this is an introductory session, just laying out some of the ground. Now, more specifically for Joyce, this period of horror and hope is felt particularly strongly in Ireland, one of the first colonized nations of the modern world. As you may or may not know, what Joyce referred to as the nightmare of history was in Ulysses, was in particular the nightmare of Irish history. In 1177, the Normans had established King John as Lord of Ireland. Between 1534 and 1603, a period of intense colonization followed, where Protestants were sent into the Catholic country in what was called the plantation policy. There was resistance to that. In 1649 and up to 1653, Cromwell had to pacify Ireland, resulting in a third of the population being killed or exiled to the Caribbean as forced labourers. In 1800, an Act of Union established the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, and from the 1880s, the Irish Parliamentary Party sought home rule, largely through constitutional processes, and Parnell's Irish Parliamentary Party played a very active role. It's in the period of kind of high modernism between 1912 and 1923 that we have what's often known as the Irish Revolutionary period, in Easter 1916, the Easter Uprising, and in 1922, the partition of Ireland into the 6 counties of Northern Ireland, which remained in the United Kingdom, and then the rest of Ireland with its Catholic majority. All of these long history of troubles continued and were amplified in the 1960s with what was called the Troubles in Northern Ireland. On the 30th of June 1972, known as Bloody Sunday, when 13 civilians were killed by paratroopers. In 2005, you finally seemed to have an end to the conflict with the ceasefire from the Provisional IRA, the actively military wing of the IRA. And in 2020, Ireland, the question of Ireland still remains a complex one in the now completed, apparently, negotiations around Brexit. So when Joyce says in at school to his school head of school in the second episode of Ulysses that history is a nightmare from which I'm trying to awaken, he's very much speaking of Irish history. And indeed, in 1907, Joyce summed up that little history I just, outlined to you in a few dates and notes, that the Irish question is still unresolved today after 6 centuries of armed occupation and over 100 years of legislation that has led to the decrease of the population of this unhappy island from 8 to 4 million. So Joyce was fully aware of the long historical background to the nightmare of Irish history, and it is something which he addresses very forcefully in Ulysses, as we will see. Okay, so much then for the political background to modernism, these cataclysmic changes, these historical pressures, this violence and bloodshed, and also hope as well as horror that was really, really alive and vital in this period. That's the background to understanding modernism as an aesthetic moment. Let's switch now to giving you some bearings for understanding Ulysses in relation to that larger aesthetic moment or movement by looking a little bit at the question, when was modernism? And here I like to use a cinematic terminology, because like with any literary or cultural period, a term like modernism has kind of slightly multiple meanings, and it's important to try and get a sense of these and why they seem to differ from each other so that you can confidently use them and get a grip on them. So I like to say that we can look at modernism and the question of when it was in terms of a kind of a long shot, a long distance historical view of modernism, a medium shot or medium close up, a close up and an extreme close up. And you'll see that Ulysses is right in the center of that extreme close up. But the long shot, the period of long modernism goes really, I think, from around 1857 and the publication of Flaubert's Madame Bovary to maybe even as late as 1950 and the publication of Samuel Beckett's Malone Dies. It's more or less a century of varied artistic experimentation. Varied, but as I'll try and show in a moment, with some significant unifying features which help us to understand the quiddity of modernism as well as the specificity of Ulysses within modernism. A kind of medium shot of modernism is a narrower one, and I'd suggest that comes from around 1905 to 1934, and that's sort of illustrated politically from in and through the Bloody Sunday Revolution in Russia of 1905 through 1917, and the revolution right up until a convenient date of 1934, when the Congress of Soviet Writers enforces socialist realism and effectively, more or less anyway, brings an end to the modernist experiment in Russia. A close-up period is 1919 to 1927. immediately after the First World War and into the decade of the 20s. This is a great period of various experimentations. But kind of right at the center of modernism is the year 1922, with the publication of James Joyce's Ulysses, also T.S. Eliot's Wasteland, and in France, Breton's Magnetic Waves. After the publication of Ulysses, Ezra Pound, perhaps modernism's greatest publicizer, began to sign his letters PSU, Postscriptum Ulysses, instead of BC or AD, before Christ or after death. He signs his letters with the dates of PSU, Postscriptum Ulysses. In other words, regarding Ulysses as a real turning point and core text of modernism. I'll be talking, much more about what modernism was, but I just thought it would be helpful for you to see that when people talk about modernism, you can get confused because they might be talking about long modernism, medium modernism, or intense modernism. Just wanted to give you that little historical model of when it was. Moving more specifically into modernism, not when was modernism, but what was modernism? And again, the great spokesperson of modernism, the American artist Ezra Pound, who moved to Europe and particularly London, I think provided a very handy slogan for understanding modernism with his words, "Make it new." And it's important to understand in a phrase like this that you can't get anywhere with it unless or until you begin to get a referent for what the it is referring to. Okay, make it new, but make what new? And here my argument for this course, and many people agree that it's not particularly original in any way, is that the it that had to be remade was realism, the kind of predecessor large bag of artistic movements that came prior to modernism. And at stake in this making it new were questions of representation, of perspective, of point of view, and of defamiliarization. All of which, I'm mentioning now because I'll be talking about them in this week's lectures and so on. So, when was modernism? Well, you have long modernism, 1850s, 1950 more or less, medium modernism, 1905, 1934. The high point of modernism, you can even say, is 1922. That's when modernism was. What was modernism? Well, it's the unity across so many different arts of changing things, of making it new, of finding new modes of representation, new ideas of perspective, all kind of different forms of defamiliarization. Within this, you have Joyce's own particular kind of modernism. And he found his own motto expressed in A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man and in Ulysses as a simple Latin phrase, non serviam, I do not serve, or I will not serve, a refusal to serve, and a need to break with established forms of authority, both religious, aesthetic, and political, to seek out an independent path. Okay, so the central claim of the course is that in order to get hold of Ulysses and begin to understand it, the easiest way of doing this is to think a little bit about what it means to say that Ulysses is a modernist text. And I want to, replay this question or this approach by giving you another way of thinking about modernism, or, just kind of extending what I've been saying, is to recognize that modernism is a relational term. And that's to say that the way to get hold of it is not to think of it in isolation, but rather to think of it in relation to predecessor and postcessor forms. And the main predecessor, or the catch bag of predecessors, I'm calling realism, and what comes after as postmodernism. And it's by kind of looking at these against each other that you can really get to understand something about modernism and something about how this extraordinary book Ulysses works, and that will enable you to really get inside the book. So very roughly and briefly, if we understand modernism as a relational term, as well as a historical term and a political term, as an aesthetic term, as I said before, to go deeper into it, we have to grasp the relations between realism and modernism. And this means understanding some ideas about realism, in which we might say that the realist text, whether it be a visual text or a narrative text, is understood generally as a mirror onto the world, a mirror of the world. Realism aims to be objective. It aims to be photographic, in a sense, to reproduce the world. And I'll be, talking much more about that in the lecture tomorrow, of course. Modernism, I'll be suggesting, grows out of realism. It's not really completely opposed to realism, but it emerges from it. It emerges from some lacunae in realism, is what we'll try and see. It talks about the text rather than as a mirror of the world, than as a framing of the world. And with that framing, an emphasis comes to be placed less on the objective natures of the narrative or representation, and more on the subjective qualities of the narrative or representation. And this is particularly kind of epitomized by the notion of the stream of consciousness, which is, many people say, it's not exactly true, to be an invention of Joyce's, particularly in Ulysses, although very strongly anticipated in A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. And so we'll be talking quite a lot about stream of consciousness as a key feature of modernism, a key aesthetic device of modernism, and how that emerges from forms of realism. At the same time, I think a way of getting to understand Ulysses in particular and modernism in general is not just to see it as related to but different from the realist text, but also to see it as related to but different from the postmodern text. And postmodernism in this sense twists the screw a little bit tighter, and it now, rather than emphasizing the frame as modernism does, it's interested in destroying the frame. instead of giving a place to the subjective from out of the objective, it questions the unity of subjectivity itself. It goes further than modernism and realism. But really, as I say, the thing with these terms is the best way to understand them is to see them in relation to each other rather than try and grasp them in isolation. And I mentioned the three because what's really extraordinary about Joyce is that as an artist, he's someone whose work exhibits all of these three different forms of artistic creation. Dubliners is very much a realist text, as we'll see. Ulysses and A Portrait of the Artist are a part of the emergence of modernism. But Joyce didn't stop there. With Finnegan's Wake, he moves into a completely other realm of artistic expression and narration with the extraordinary book Finnegan's Wake, which, by the way, if you found Ulysses daunting, I think you'll find Finnegan's Wake daunting to the 100th degree. It does have its pleasures, but it's a very peculiar text. And, I'll discuss it a little bit just to give you some taste of it as we go on this week. And also to see how some aspects of it are anticipated in Ulysses, and particularly in parts of Ulysses, which on a first reading, people find very hard to grasp. So again, remember, all of this is kind of focused on Ulysses, and one of the things that people experience as a difficulty in reading it is precisely this interrelation between realism, modernism, and postmodernism, because Ulysses is really a kind of meld or montage of all of these three forms of expression. So you can read some of the book in quite a realist way, but then you have to recognize when that realism is disappearing to be replaced by modernist forms of expression. And very strikingly, and as a testament to the ingenuity and genius of Joyce, there are also moments where the modernist forms of expression, themselves very new and original at the time, give way to anticipations of a postmodern consciousness. This is what makes Joyce one of those incredible canonical figures. He's both one of the masters of realist writers. He's one of the inventors of modernism, and he's also one of the anticipators of what is to become postmodern forms of expression. It's extremely unusual for any thinker or artist or creator to master not only one kind of sphere of expression, but two and even three. It's really, really an extraordinary thing for somebody to do. And that's why the book Ulysses raises some difficulties, but why, as Jung, who didn't enjoy it very much at first, grew to love the book as he spent more time with it. And that, I think, is, what I'm hoping you will find this course can help you with, is how to spend a little bit more time with Ulysses so that you can get a better grip on it, so you can enjoy it more and begin a really interesting voyage of discovery, which many people have undertaken. And it's why, Joyce scholarship has this very interesting feature, which is that on the one hand, it's both a scholarship of professionals. There are many academics across the world who are specialists in Joyce, who know, much, much more about Joyce than I do. I'm a kind of amateur Joyce scholar. There's a professional cadre of Joyce specialists. But what is so, so striking is that there's also a very large popular readership of Joyce. And this comes through in how on every Bloomsday, all across the world, in cities across the world, there are often 24-hour-long readings of Ulysses by interested readers. And there are kind of amateur journals which cater for Joyce. In this sense, it's a little like astronomy. Astronomy works because there are both dedicated academic astronomers, but there are also hundreds of thousands of people who have telescopes, who observe the sky, who note things, and there's actually a constant dialogue between amateur astronomers and professional astronomers. They both share in growing to understand and tabulate what's happening in the universe. Similarly, with Joyce, there's both a professional and a private readership or a public readership. And I'm presuming that you guys who are here today are interested in, or you already are a part of, that public readership of Joyce. Okay, so just to as we begin to come to the end of our time, just to give a little bit of substance to these rather abstract terms of realism, modernism, postmodernism, and so on that I've been talking about, I thought it would be nice to look at some visual things, as we're predominantly in this visual medium of teams. And of course, what realism is. And here's, a very beautiful and very simple example of realism in painting. Vermeer's Kitchen Maid, or Milkmaid, sometimes called, from 1667 or 1668. And as you look at this picture, you can see what realism is. It's the accurate description of everyday life. Indeed, the photographic description of everyday life. Of course, 1667 is far away from the objectivity of the camera lens, but doesn't this really look like a photo? It has a very carefully delineated depth of field, perspective, wonderful coloring, a real observation of how light falls both on the figure of the person and on the objects in the kitchen, the glow of the white milk as it's poured into a bowl. I mean, it's like a photo, and that I'm suggesting is one of the things that realism is. It tries to have a photographic apprehension or grip on the world. In painting, modernism begins in the mid to late 19th century, and it deals with real objects, but what it emphasizes is the individual's take on those objects at a particular moment of time. It's very aware of the subjectivity of the objective, how an objective thing like here Rouen Cathedral can really look different in different lights at different times of the day from one week to another. There's something momentary and subjective about our sense of the real. And it's that emphasis on the subjective and the momentary that makes the break with realism. Realism promises to give you the world as it's objectively seen. But when you probe that more carefully, you begin to find that the world as objectively seen is actually subjectively seen as well. And with these two images here, they're from a whole series of paintings that Monet did of the cathedral, just showing this essence of modernism, this subjectivity of the objective, which we'll be, talking about as we go on. I talked about how Joyce, as an artist, is someone who is able to master and move from one form of expression to another, from realism to modernism, from modernism to postmodernism. And I do find these visual comparisons or analogies really, really useful, because you can see them. And here you have an artist, a visual artist, who does something has a similar movement. He begins drawing and painting very much as a realist. With the image on the left, you have again this careful construction of an image which is like a photograph of reality. This bridge over the river, the house, the careful shading of the trees, everything in proportion, in its place, giving you an accurate, objective account of a portion of reality. Some years later, Turner begins to, in probing that surface of the real, to find again that this is often, there's something about fleeting and momentary appearance, how reality appears to a subject, a person at one moment in time, which leads to the painting on the right, which, as you can see, that could almost be an completely abstract painting of just colors and light and a few shapes, but it's still got realist enough for you to be able to see some of the objects, and it hovers between realism, modernism, and postmodernism, I think. And that is, as I say, you can think of that as we begin to read Ulysses tomorrow. You'll see that exactly that transition between two modes of seeing and expression is what happens. Postmodernism in painting has really done away with all figuration and concentrates on the materials of expression, the paint, the canvas, and so on itself. And one of my favorite exponents, and I think for many people, is the extraordinary canvases of Mark Rothko. Unforgettable, once seen in the flesh, as it were, living and vibrant with light and expression, but not with representation at all. And that, I think, in a way, it helps you to understand Finnegan's Wake, as I'll try and show as we go on. Now, we'll be talking about Ulysses, and it's impossible to do that without understanding some of the specifics of Irish modernism as Joyce experienced it. But I think as we come to the end of our time, I'm going to stop here so that we have some time for questions or comments, and we'll simply, continue our investigations tomorrow. As you know, the lectures, they're all part of one narrative, so we can easily stop here and continue tomorrow. So let me stop there, and I hope this has given you a sense of some of the ways we'll be investigating Ulysses as a modernist text, understanding modernism as a political and aesthetic movement, an aesthetic movement with a political dimension with an aesthetic manifestation, when modernism was, what's in it, how a good way of understanding it is relationally, through understanding realism and postmodernism as contrasting features. And, you know, that's what we'll be applying to Ulysses as a way of getting our bearings on Ulysses in the days to come. So I'm not quite sure how to turn off my PowerPoint, but I can leave it up for you, I think. And then I'll just say that I've also prepared, as well as the PowerPoints, I'm going to give you some other materials. Some is just some extra reading of some of my favorite, or things which I think you might like, written about Ulysses, which I'll put to you. And then I might also give you some, as it were, exercises to do in reading. But let me stop there and go to any questions and hand over to, is it Zuleika who's doing this, or Lance who's being the moderator? I'm not quite sure, but I'll hand over to the moderator now. Thank you.